They say the mind can play tricks on you. But what if the ones around you insist you're losing yours when you know you're clinging to the last threads of sanity? The day my husband walked out of the doctor's office, whispering that I was losing my mind, I felt every fiber of my being fracture. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. For 51 years, I've lived in the same cramped Chicago apartment on Lake Shore Drive, where the wallpaper has faded from yellow roses to ghostly cream, and the scent of brewing coffee never quite warms the chill that has settled into my bones. I wake every morning at 5:30, not because I want to, but because my body has memorized the rhythm of serving others before myself. The routine was always the same. Fold Richard's shirts with precision, iron the creases he'd inspect with critical eyes, prepare his breakfast exactly how he liked it. 2 eggs over easy, toast barely golden, coffee black as his moods had become. My hands shake now, arthritis making simple tasks feel like climbing mountains, but I never complained. Complaining was weakness, Richard always said. Outside my kitchen window, Chicago bustled with life. Yellow taxis honked their way down Michigan Avenue, neighbors chatted on front steps, children laughed on their way to school. But inside these 4 walls, I felt like a ghost, carrying decades of memories that seemed to matter to no one but me. Last Tuesday changed everything. I had begged Richard to come with me to Dr. Evans's office on Clark Street. My memory had been slipping. Small things, like forgetting where I put my reading glasses or standing in the grocery store, unable to remember what I came to buy. The confusion scared me. I needed someone to hold my hand, to tell me I wasn't losing myself completely. Richard sat in the waiting room, scrolling through his phone with the same irritation he showed when I asked him to help with anything. When Dr. Evans called us in, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe together we could figure out what was happening to me. But as I described my symptoms, the forgetfulness, the moments of confusion, the overwhelming fatigue, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Richard wasn't looking at me with concern or compassion. His eyes held something else entirely, something calculating. When Dr. Evans stepped out to get some forms, Richard leaned forward and whispered to the nurse, just loud enough for me to hear, that I was losing it, really losing it, and that he didn't know how much longer he could handle this. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at my husband, this man who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, and saw a stranger. The same eyes that once sparkled when he proposed to me at Navy Pier now held cold calculation. He wanted others to believe I was broken. That night, I sat in our living room holding our old photo album. Page after page of memories, our wedding day at St. Michael's, vacations to Lake Geneva, Christmas mornings with our children, Emily and David, when they were small and still thought I hung the moon. In every picture, I was smiling, giving, loving without reservation. When had that love turned into burden? When had I become something to manage instead of someone to cherish? You see, I had given everything to this family. Everything. In the early years, when money was tight, and Richard was struggling to establish his construction business, I worked double shifts at Miller's Deli on Division Street. My feet would swell until I could barely walk, but I never complained. The money I earned went straight into our joint account, money that eventually helped Richard invest in stocks that would make him a small fortune over the years. When Emily was born, I quit my job to care for her full-time. Then came David 2 years later. I was up all night with fevers, colic, nightmares. I packed lunches, helped with homework, drove to soccer practice and piano lessons and dance recitals. I made Halloween costumes by hand, baked birthday cakes from scratch, created magic from nothing because we couldn't afford much else. Emily used to tell me how much I did for them, wrapping her little arms around my waist. Those hugs were everything to me then. But somewhere along the way, Quick hugs replaced long conversations. Thank yous became habit rather than feeling. As the years passed, Richard's construction business grew. The stock market investments I had helped fund began paying off handsomely. We weren't wealthy exactly, but we were comfortable, more than comfortable. Richard had accumulated assets worth several $100,000, including some cryptocurrency he'd bought early that had grown substantially in value. But with financial success came expectations. When Emily graduated from college and needed money for her wedding, I emptied my small savings account without question. When David lost his job during the recession, we supported his family for 8 months. When Richard's mother needed expensive nursing care, I took on a part-time job at the library to help cover costs. It was always a question of if I could help with the down payment, or if I could lend money for car repairs, or watch the kids for the weekend. I said yes to everything. Always yes. Because that's what mothers do, what wives do. We give until there's nothing left, and then we find more to give. But something shifted in recent years. The requests became demands. The gratitude became expectation. And Richard's attitude toward me became something I barely recognized. He would tell me I was imagining things again when I mentioned feeling tired or overwhelmed. He'd call me dramatic when I asked for help with household tasks that were becoming difficult with my arthritis. He'd insist I worried too much when I expressed concern about our finances or our family relationships. Slowly, I began to doubt myself. Was I being dramatic? Was I imagining the coldness in their voices, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, the feeling that I was becoming invisible in my own home? The doctor visits became another battleground. Each time I mentioned a symptom, the joint pain that kept me awake, the memory lapses that frightened me, the depression that settled over me like fog, Richard would interrupt. He'd tell the doctors that I had always been anxious, that I tended to exaggerate symptoms, and that he thought it was attention-seeking behavior. Attention-seeking behavior. As if 51 years of putting everyone else first was somehow selfish. As if asking for basic care and compassion was too much. The breaking point came last month. My 73rd birthday arrived on a rainy Thursday in October. I had mentioned the date several times, even circled it on the kitchen calendar in red ink. But the day passed without acknowledgement. No calls from Emily or David. No card from Richard. Nothing. I sat at the kitchen table that evening, surrounded by the silence of a home that no longer felt like home. I lit a single birthday candle on a piece of toast and made a wish. I wished to matter to someone. Anyone. 2 days later, Richard announced he was going to visit his brother in Naperville for the weekend. Something in his tone made me suspicious. We hadn't seen his brother in over a year, and suddenly it was urgent? When I asked why now, he replied that I wouldn't understand, that it was business, and grabbed his jacket. That night, alone in our apartment, I did something I never thought I'd do. I slipped a small voice recorder into the pocket of Richard's jacket. It was a tiny device I'd bought months earlier when I was considering recording doctor appointments to help remember instructions. I told myself I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Proof that something was terribly wrong with how I was being treated. The weekend dragged by. I cleaned the apartment, tended to my small herb garden on the fire escape, and tried to quiet the voice in my head that whispered I was being paranoid. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe I was imagining things. He returned Sunday evening in a mood I couldn't read. Distant, but almost excited? He went straight to his study and closed the door, making phone calls in hushed tones that carried through the thin walls but not the words. Monday morning, after he left for work, I retrieved the recorder from his jacket pocket with trembling hands. My heart pounded as I pressed play, not sure I was ready for what I might hear. What I heard destroyed something inside me that had already been cracking for years. It was Richard's voice, clear and calculating, telling his brother Frank that I was too much work now. What with the doctor visits, the complaints, the way I followed him around like a lost puppy. And the money, he complained. The money they were spending on my medications and treatments. His brother's voice asked what he was thinking. Richard replied that he had been looking into options, that there was a place in Wisconsin, not too expensive, nothing fancy, but clean and safe. He said I would be taken care of, and he'd be free to, live his life. Frank asked about the house and the savings. Richard explained that was the beauty of it. If I was declared incompetent, he would get full control of everything: the checking account, the investment portfolio, even the Bitcoin holdings. He bragged that I didn't even know about half of what we were worth, that he'd been smart about keeping me out of the financial picture. Frank asked about the kids. Richard laughed, a sound that made my blood freeze. He said Emily was already on board, that she thought her mother needed professional care. He admitted David was harder to convince, but figured he would come around when he realized there might be an inheritance worth fighting for. The recording went on for 43 minutes. 43 minutes of my husband and his brother discussing my life like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. They talked about forging documents, finding doctors who would declare me incompetent, even staging incidents to make me appear unstable. I sat on my kitchen floor, holding that small recorder, and felt something break inside me that had been holding me together for decades. The betrayal tasted like copper pennies in my mouth. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the device. For 51 years, I had loved this man completely. I had given him my youth, my dreams, my identity. I had supported his business with my wages, raised his children while he built his fortune, cared for his mother when she was dying. I had been loyal, faithful, devoted, and he saw me as nothing more than an expensive burden. I crawled to the living room and looked at our wedding picture on the mantel. That young woman in white, so full of hope and love, trusting completely that the man beside her would protect and cherish her forever. What would I tell her if I could travel back in time? That evening, I dropped my favorite coffee mug, the one Emily had given me for Mother's Day years ago, painted with tiny flowers. It shattered against the kitchen tiles, and I stared at the pieces scattered across the floor, like my marriage, like my family, like my trust. But in that moment of destruction, something else happened, something unexpected. I whispered, "No more." The words came from somewhere deep inside me, a place that had been buried under decades of people-pleasing and self-sacrifice. No more. For the first time in years, I didn't clean up the broken pieces immediately. I left them there and went to bed, where I slept more soundly than I had in months. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw a stranger, a woman with gray hair and lines around her eyes, but also something else, something that looked almost like strength. I had a choice to make. I could continue pretending everything was fine, continue being the convenient victim of my family's manipulation, or I could do something I had never done in my adult life. I could fight back. But fighting back meant risking everything. It meant potentially losing the only family I had, even if that family was treating me terribly. At 73, who would I be without them? The fear was paralyzing. Loneliness seemed worse than disrespect. At least with Richard and the children, I had some sense of purpose, even if that purpose was being used. I spent 3 days pacing our small apartment, playing the recording over and over, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood something. Maybe Richard was just frustrated. Maybe he didn't really mean it. But deep down, I knew better. The coldness in his voice, the casual way he discussed discarding me. This wasn't momentary frustration. This was a man who had stopped seeing me as human years ago. On Thursday, I did something that surprised even me. I bought a small notebook and began writing down every incident I could remember of being dismissed, belittled, or ignored. The list grew longer than I expected. Richard interrupting me at dinner parties. Emily rolling her eyes when I offered advice. David changing the subject whenever I tried to talk about my health concerns. The casual cruelties that had become so normal I had stopped noticing them. But I also wrote down other things. Moments that contradicted their narrative of me as incompetent or unstable. I still balanced our checkbook to the penny. I still remembered every grandchild's birthday, every family anniversary, every important date. I still cooked elaborate holiday meals, managed our household, and handled all the emotional labor of maintaining family relationships. I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing my will to continue being their convenient target. That Sunday, David called to ask if I could babysit his twins while he and his wife went to a wedding. The request was typical, last minute, assumed rather than asked, with no consideration for whether I might have other plans. For the first time in my adult life, I said no. I could hear the shock in David's voice when he asked what I meant by no. I simply told him I had other plans. He shot back, asking what plans, saying I never had plans. The casual dismissal of my entire existence stung, but it also strengthened my resolve. I told him I had plans now, and hung up before he could guilt me into changing my mind. My hands were shaking, but I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of setting a boundary. Within an hour, Emily called, then Richard, both confused, slightly angry, demanding to know what was wrong with me. I told each of them that nothing was wrong with me, and that was exactly the point. That night, I pulled out all our old photo albums and spread them across the living room floor. 51 years of memories, graduations, holidays, vacations, celebrations. In every single picture, I was there, organizing, serving, celebrating others' achievements, making everyone else's life smoother and happier. But looking at those photos now, I saw something else. I saw a woman disappearing by degrees. In the early pictures, I had opinions, preferences, dreams. As the years progressed, I became background, a supporting character in everyone else's story. I took one photo, Richard and me at Navy Pier during our courtship, young and laughing, and packed the rest away. That young woman deserved better than what her future held, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for the woman I had become. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Isabel Garcia, my upstairs neighbor. Isabel was 68, a widow who had raised 4 children and buried a husband she loved deeply. She was also the only person in my life who seemed to see me as a complete human being. When I asked if we could talk, she told me I sounded different, stronger somehow. I told her everything. The recording, the years of manipulation, the plan to have me declared incompetent. Isabel listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "My dear, you know what you have to do. The question is whether you're brave enough to do it." The second call was harder. I looked up elder law attorneys in Chicago and found one who offered free consultations. Laura Bennett had been practicing for 20 years and specialized in protecting seniors from financial abuse. During our phone call, she told me what I was describing was unfortunately common. She explained that family members often target elderly relatives' assets, especially when there's a significant amount of money involved, and that my husband's cryptocurrency and investment portfolio alone made me a prime target. I asked her what I could do, saying I was just a housewife. She replied that I was a woman whose rights had been violated, and that I had options, Mrs. Morrison, more options than I realized. I made an appointment for the following week. For the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope. The weekend brought another test. Richard announced that Emily and her family were coming for Sunday dinner, and that David and his wife would join us. He told me to make that roast they liked, not asking, assuming I would comply as I always had, and that chocolate cake Emily was always asking for. I stood at the kitchen counter, looking at the grocery list I had automatically started writing, and stopped. "No," I said. He asked what I meant. I told him no, and that if they wanted dinner, they could help cook it, or we could order takeout. Richard's face went through several expressions: confusion, annoyance, and finally anger. He asked what had gotten into me lately that I was acting strange. Strange. Code for not compliant, not invisible, not conveniently silent. I told him I was acting like someone who deserved basic respect. He scoffed at respect, reminding me he had been supporting me for 50 years. I retorted that I had been supporting him right back, cooking, cleaning, raising his children, taking care of his mother, working when we needed money, giving up every dream I ever had to make his life easier. I asked him when exactly I got to stop earning the right to be treated like a human being. Richard stared at me like I had grown a second head. Maybe I had. Maybe the old Eleanor, the one who absorbed disrespect like a sponge, was finally gone. Sunday dinner was tense. I made sandwiches instead of roast, served store-bought cookies instead of homemade cake. Emily complained about the strange meal. David asked if I was feeling all right. Richard glared at me from across the table, but I sat straighter than I had in years. I met their eyes instead of looking down at my plate. I participated in conversations instead of just serving and clearing. As she was leaving, Emily said I seemed different. It wasn't a compliment. I replied that I was exactly the same. I was just not pretending anymore that being treated poorly was normal. That week, I had my first meeting with Laura Bennett. Her office was in a converted brownstone near Lincoln Park, and she offered me coffee in a real mug, not a paper cup, a small kindness that almost made me cry. She asked me to tell her about my financial situation, pulling out a legal pad. I realized I didn't know as much as I should. Richard handled business, had always handled it, claiming it was too complicated for me to understand. But I knew about the checking account we shared, the savings account with both our names, the house we owned outright. What I didn't know was that Richard had opened several accounts in his name only, including investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money that had grown from the foundation I had helped build with my wages from the deli, my unpaid labor as mother and homemaker, my sacrifices of personal dreams and ambitions. Laura explained that in Illinois, assets acquired during marriage are considered marital property regardless of whose name is on the account. She told me I had rights to those investments, that cryptocurrency, all of it, but that we needed to act quickly if my husband was planning to have me declared incompetent. She gave me homework, gathering financial documents, recording any conversations where Richard discussed his plans, documenting instances of emotional abuse or manipulation. Most importantly, she said as I was leaving, I needed to understand that I was not powerless, that I had been trained to believe I was, but that wasn't reality. I walked home from that appointment through Lincoln Park, watching families play on playgrounds, couples walking dogs, elderly people feeding ducks at the pond, normal life continuing all around me while my world was being rebuilt from the ground up. That evening, Richard came home in a particularly good mood. He'd had lunch with his brother and seemed pleased about something. Over dinner, he said he had been thinking, and that maybe we should consider moving somewhere smaller, easier to maintain, less expensive. I knew this was the beginning, the first step in his plan to isolate me, control me, eventually discard me. I asked him where he had in mind. He mentioned a nice place in Wisconsin, a senior living facility with very reasonable rates. Senior living. Code for the facility they had discussed on the recording. I told him calmly that I liked it here, that I liked our neighborhood and our friends. Richard's tone was dismissive as he asked what friends I had, saying I barely left the apartment except for doctor's appointments. The cruelty was casual, automatic. A reminder that in his mind, I had already ceased to be a full person. I said quietly that I had friends, more than he might think. 3 weeks later, I was ready for the confrontation I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Laura had helped me understand my legal rights, Isabel had provided emotional support, and I had finally found my voice. I asked Richard to call the children and arrange a family meeting. He seemed pleased, probably thinking I was ready to discuss options for my future care. When Emily arrived with her husband and 2 teenagers, I told them we needed to have a serious conversation. David came alone. His wife suddenly had other plans when she learned the meeting was serious. They gathered in our living room, the same room where I had entertained them for decades, where Christmas mornings had unfolded, where we had celebrated every milestone and weathered every crisis. I had prepared for weeks, but my hands still shook as I stood before them. I began by telling them I knew what they had been planning. Richard's face flushed as he asked what I was talking about. Instead of explaining, I pulled out a small speaker and pressed play. Their voices filled the room, Richard and his brother discussing my future like I was livestock to be sold. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's teenagers stared at their grandfather with something approaching horror. David's face went pale. He finally broke the silence, asking his dad what the hell was going on. Emily's voice cracked as she said he couldn't do this to me. Richard defensively claimed that I needed care, professional care, that I'd been acting erratic and forgetful. I interrupted him, saying that I'd been acting like someone who refuses to be invisible anymore, and that there was a difference. I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up our wedding photo. The young couple smiling back seemed like strangers now. I held up the picture and told them that for 51 years I had believed in this, in us, in this family, that I had given everything I had to all of them and never asked for anything in return except basic human decency. Slowly, deliberately, I tore the photo in half. Emily gasped my name. I continued, saying I was not their problem to be managed, not their burden to be discarded, and not their convenient target for manipulation and control. I walked to the kitchen and returned with a lockbox I had purchased the week before. Inside were the bank cards Richard had always controlled, the checkbook he managed, the important documents he kept safe from me. David's voice was strained as he asked his dad if it was true, if he was really going to have me declared incompetent. Richard's silence was answer enough. I told them I wanted them to understand something, my voice growing stronger with each word. I would no longer buy love with my compliance. I would no longer accept disrespect in exchange for the privilege of being tolerated. I would no longer pretend that their convenience was more important than my dignity. Emily was crying now, saying they didn't know. I told her they knew enough. They knew I was unhappy. They knew I was being dismissed and ignored. They knew, and they chose to look the other way because it was easier than standing up for me. I locked the box and placed it on the coffee table between us. I announced that from now on, things were going to change. I would not be cooking elaborate meals for people who couldn't be bothered to say thank you. I would not be lending money to children who treated me like an ATM. I would not be sacrificing my health and happiness for people who saw me as expendable. Richard stood up, his face red with anger, telling me I couldn't do this, that I didn't understand the finances or the legal implications. I informed him that I understood more than he thought, that I had learned quite a lot about marital property laws, about elder abuse, and about my rights as a human being and a citizen of this state. He said desperately that I was being manipulated by someone, that this wasn't me talking. This was exactly me talking, I replied, for the first time in decades. The room erupted in arguments, tears, accusations. Richard tried the old tactics, gaslighting, emotional manipulation, threats. Emily wavered between guilt and defensiveness. David seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of his father's betrayal, but I remained calm, centered in a way I hadn't felt since I was young. The chaos around me couldn't touch the quiet strength I had finally found. When the shouting died down, I told them what was going to happen. Anyone who wanted to be part of my life going forward would treat me with the respect they would show any other adult human being. Anyone who couldn't manage that level of basic decency would not be welcome in my home or my life. Emily said through her tears that I was being unreasonable. I told her I was being reasonable for the first time in my adult life, and that it only felt unreasonable to her because she had never had to consider my feelings before. They left that evening in various states of anger, confusion, and what I hoped might be the beginning of remorse. Richard slept in the guest room, and we didn't speak for 3 days. I thought the worst was over. I thought I had won some kind of victory. But I had underestimated the depth of Richard's desperation and the cruelty he was capable of when cornered. 2 months later, just as I was beginning to feel proud of my new boundaries, just as I was starting to enjoy the peace of a home without constant tension, Richard played a card I hadn't expected. He started telling people I was having a mental breakdown. I first learned about it from Mrs. Kim, who lived across the hall. She knocked on my door one morning with a concerned expression and a covered dish. She told me Richard had said I'd been having a difficult time, that I'd been saying strange things and acting paranoid, and she had brought me some soup. My blood went cold. I asked her what exactly he had told her. She said he'd claimed I'd been accusing him of trying to steal from me, that I had become suspicious and volatile, and that he had seemed so worried about me. I thanked Mrs. Kim for the soup and closed the door, my hands shaking with rage. This was it, the final phase of his plan. If he couldn't have me declared legally incompetent, he would destroy my reputation so thoroughly that no one would believe my side of the story. Over the next week, I discovered the full extent of his campaign. He had called our insurance company, suggesting I needed psychiatric evaluation. He had spoken to Dr. Evans, expressing concerns about my mental state. He had reached out to Emily's friends, David's colleagues, even the mailman, painting himself as the long-suffering husband of an increasingly unstable woman. The isolation was swift and devastating. Phone calls stopped coming. Invitations dried up. Even Isabel seemed more distant, unsure what to believe. I sat in my kitchen one evening, surrounded by the evidence of a life that was being systematically destroyed, and felt the walls closing in. This was how it would end. Not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet character assassination. Death by 1,000 whispers. But then I remembered something Laura had told me during one of our sessions. The truth has weight. Lies might spread faster, but truth has staying power. Instead of falling apart, I did something Richard hadn't expected. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every lie, every attempt at manipulation, I recorded it all. I kept a detailed journal. I saved text messages and emails. I gathered evidence like a detective building a case. And then I did something that terrified me more than any of the previous confrontations. I reached out to people directly. I called Mrs. Kim back and played her the recording of Richard discussing his plans. I met with Dr. Evans and presented a timeline of Richard's manipulation campaign. I contacted Emily and David and laid out, methodically and calmly, exactly how their father was attempting to destroy my credibility. The response wasn't immediate, but it was profound. People began to see the pattern. The concerned husband narrative fell apart when confronted with evidence of his calculated cruelty. Emily called me 3 weeks later, crying. She said she was so sorry, that she hadn't wanted to believe it. But when I showed her those recordings, and when she really thought about how her dad talked about me, she broke down, asking what they had done to me. David was slower to come around. But eventually he too began to see the manipulation he had been subjected to. Not just my manipulation, his own. Richard had been playing him against me for years, using family dynamics to maintain control. The final confrontation came 6 months after I had first discovered Richard's plan. He arrived home one evening to find his suitcases packed in the hallway. He demanded to know what this was. I told him it was him leaving tonight. He argued that I couldn't throw him out of his own house. I corrected him, reminding him it was our house, that we bought it with money I helped earn, that I helped maintain it for 51 years, and that according to my attorney, I absolutely could ask him to leave. His face went through the familiar progression: surprise, anger, manipulation tactics. He pleaded with me to be reasonable, that we could work this out, suggesting marriage counseling, admitting he had made mistakes. I told him he had plotted to have me declared incompetent so he could steal assets I helped build and abandon me in a nursing home. And that wasn't a mistake. It was calculated cruelty. He asked where he would go. For just a moment, a flicker of the old Eleanor felt sorry for him. 51 years of marriage doesn't disappear overnight, even when that marriage became toxic. But then I remembered his voice on that recording, casually discussing my disposal like I was broken furniture. I remembered the months of gaslighting, the character assassination, the complete absence of remorse. I told him that was no longer my problem to solve. He left that night, and for the first time in decades, I slept alone in my own bed without feeling lonely. The silence wasn't empty, it was peaceful. The divorce took 8 months. Laura was brilliant, methodical, and fierce in protecting my rights. We recovered access to investment accounts I hadn't even known existed. Richard's cryptocurrency holdings, which had grown substantially over the years, were divided according to Illinois' equitable distribution laws. But the money wasn't the victory. The victory was waking up each morning in a home where I wasn't walking on eggshells, where I wasn't bracing for criticism, where I could make decisions about my own life. I started small. I painted the kitchen yellow, a color Richard had always hated. I bought plants and filled the apartment with green life. I threw away clothes that I had kept only because they were practical, and bought a few things simply because I liked them. I joined a watercolor class at the Art Institute. My hands, so long devoted to serving others, learned to create beauty for its own sake. The arthritis still slowed me down, but painting gave me a different kind of purpose. The instructor, Clara, was a woman in her 60s who had returned to art after raising 5 children. She told our class one afternoon that it's never too late to remember who you were before the world told you who you should be. I reconnected with Alice, my roommate from nursing school nearly 50 years ago. We had lost touch when life got complicated, when marriage and children consumed everything. But when I reached out, it was as if no time had passed. Over coffee at a cafe in Lincoln Park, she said she had always wondered what happened to me. She remembered how passionate I was about everything: books, politics, that boyfriend who played guitar, and asked when I stopped being passionate. It was a good question. When had I stopped having opinions, preferences, dreams that belonged to me alone? The relationship with my children was complicated. Emily struggled with guilt and slowly began to treat me more like a person and less like a convenient grandmother. David remained distant, caught between loyalty to his father and recognition of how badly I had been treated. But my grandson, Emily's youngest, started visiting me on his own. He was 16, old enough to understand family complexity, and curious about the grandmother he was finally getting to know as a real person. He told me one afternoon as I taught him to paint that his dad always said I was just, boring, like I never did anything interesting. But then he found out I went to nursing school in the 60s, that I worked, that I had all these dreams. I admitted that I did have dreams, that I forgot about them for a while, but they were still there. Isabel and I grew closer. She had watched my transformation from her apartment upstairs, cheering me on through every difficult decision. One evening, as we shared dinner on my newly decorated terrace garden, she told me I inspired her. She had been afraid to date again since her husband died, but watching me refuse to settle for being treated badly made her think maybe it was time she demanded better for herself too. A year after Richard moved out, I did something I hadn't done since my honeymoon in 1972. I traveled alone. It was just a long weekend in Boston, staying in a small hotel near the Common, visiting museums and walking through neighborhoods I had never seen. But it felt revolutionary. Every decision was mine: where to eat, what to see, when to rest. On the train home, I stared out the window at the landscape rushing past and realized something profound. I wasn't who I used to be before the marriage. That young woman was gone, shaped by decades of experiences both beautiful and painful. But I wasn't who I had been during the worst years either, diminished and invisible. I was someone entirely new, someone who had survived betrayal and fought back, someone who had rediscovered her own worth after decades of being told she had none. The apartment felt different when I returned. Brighter, more alive. The walls held my paintings now, imperfect but honest attempts at capturing light and color. The kitchen smelled of herbs I grew myself. The bookshelves held novels I chose, not just cookbooks and household management guides. Richard called occasionally, usually when he needed something. Information about insurance, help finding documents, updates about the children. I was polite but distant. The anger had faded into something closer to pity. He had thrown away 51 years of partnership for the promise of controlling assets he couldn't have built without me. He had destroyed trust that could never be rebuilt, burned bridges he would never be able to cross again. At 74, he was starting over with nothing but money and the reputation of a man who had betrayed his wife of 5 decades. I was starting over with self-respect, genuine relationships, and the hard-won knowledge that I deserved better. Emily visited for my 74th birthday, the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged the date in years. She brought flowers and a card with a longer message than she had written in decades. She wrote that she knew she could never undo the years of taking me for granted, that she participated in her dad's campaign to make me feel invisible, and that she was ashamed of the woman she became when she forgot that I was a complete person with feelings and needs. She said she was trying to be better, that they were all trying to be better. We cried together that afternoon, mourning the years lost to dysfunction and celebrating the possibility of rebuilding something healthier. David remained more distant, but he sent a text on my birthday. "Happy birthday, Mom. I hope you're finding peace." It wasn't much, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that I existed as more than a convenient target for his frustrations. But the most meaningful moment came 2 months later. I was in the grocery store on Division Street, the same store where I had shopped for the family for decades, when I ran into Mrs. Davis, a woman from our old church. She exclaimed my name, saying I looked wonderful, that there was something different about me, that I was glowing. I thought about her comment as I walked home, bags of groceries I had chosen for myself, for meals I would cook because I enjoyed cooking, not because someone expected me to serve them. Maybe I was glowing. Maybe this is what happens when you stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. 6 months ago, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter in Pilsen, helping other women recognize the patterns I had lived with for so long. The work was difficult, heartbreaking, but also deeply meaningful. These women, many of them younger than my own daughters, were fighting battles I understood intimately. During one of our support group sessions, a woman named Jessica asked me how you know when it's time to leave. She was 28 with 2 small children and a husband who controlled every aspect of her life. I told her you know when staying hurts more than leaving, when you realize you've disappeared so completely that you're not sure who you are anymore, when you understand that accepting disrespect isn't love, it's self-abandonment. Jessica left her husband 3 weeks later. She sent me a photo of her new apartment, tiny but clean, safe, hers. The children were smiling in the picture, and so was she. Working with these women reminded me that my story wasn't unique. Millions of women, at every age and stage of life, were fighting to reclaim their sense of self from relationships that had consumed them. The details were different, but the core struggle was the same. Learning to believe you deserve better. As I write this, it's been 18 months since I discovered Richard's plan to discard me. 18 months since I found that voice recorder and learned the truth about my marriage. The apartment is quiet now, but it's a different kind of quiet than before. This silence belongs to me. It's not the silence of being ignored or dismissed. It's the peace of a mind that no longer needs to brace for criticism or manipulation. I sit at my kitchen table in the mornings, drinking coffee from a mug that says, "You matter," a gift from Isabel, watching the sun rise over Chicago. The herb garden on my fire escape is thriving. The watercolor paintings on my walls capture moments of beauty I might have missed when my attention was always focused on others' needs. My checking account balance reflects careful management of resources that are finally under my control. The investment portfolio that Richard tried to hide from me now generates income I use for travel, art supplies, and small luxuries I denied myself for decades. But the real wealth isn't financial. It's the knowledge that at 74 years old, I finally learned to fight for myself. It's the relationships I've built with people who see and value me as a complete human being. It's the dreams I'm pursuing that have nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or demands. Last month, I signed up for a creative writing class at Loyola University. The young instructor seemed surprised to have a student my age, but I told her something that made her smile. I told her I have 74 years of stories to tell, and I'm just getting started. The other students, mostly in their 20s and 30s, treat me with respect and genuine interest. They ask about my life experiences, my perspectives on their work, my advice about everything from relationships to career decisions, being valued for my mind, my insights, my accumulated wisdom instead of just my usefulness as a servant. It's a gift I had forgotten I deserved. 2 weeks ago, Emily called with news that surprised both of us. She and her husband were separating, not because of abuse or betrayal, but because they had grown apart and both deserved relationships that made them happy rather than just comfortable. She told me she kept thinking about what I did, how I refused to accept being treated badly just because it was familiar, and that she wanted to be that brave. I told her that bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the fear. Every step I took toward reclaiming my life terrified me. But terror was better than the slow death of accepting the unacceptable. David has been slower to rebuild our relationship, but he recently asked if I wanted to have dinner with him. Just the two of us, something that hadn't happened in years. Over pasta at a small restaurant in Lincoln Park, he told me he needed to understand what happened. Not just with me and his dad, but with all of them. How they became people who thought it was okay to treat me like that. It was a difficult conversation, but an honest one. We talked about family patterns, about how easy it is to stop seeing people as fully human when they're always available, always accommodating, always putting everyone else's needs first. As we walked back to my apartment, he said he didn't know if he could fix what he did. I agreed that he couldn't change the past, but he could choose how to treat people going forward, and that was something I was learning too. Every day is a chance to be better than yesterday. Richard and I are divorced now. The papers were finalized 3 months ago in a courthouse in downtown Chicago, where we had once gone to get our marriage license 51 years earlier. He looked older, smaller somehow, when I saw him across the courtroom. The confident man who had controlled every aspect of our household for decades seemed diminished by the consequences of his own choices. We didn't speak directly, but our lawyers negotiated the final details of our separation. I kept the apartment, he kept his construction business. We split the investment assets we had built together over 5 decades of marriage. But more importantly, I kept my dignity, my self-respect, my ability to sleep peacefully at night knowing I had fought for myself when it mattered most. I heard through Emily that Richard is dating someone, a woman in her 60s he met through his brother. Part of me feels sorry for her. She has no idea what she's getting involved with, how charming he can be at first, how gradually the control and manipulation begin. But that's not my problem to solve anymore. My job now is to live the life I almost let slip away. Yesterday, I received an unexpected visitor. Jessica, the young woman from the domestic violence shelter, came by with her children to show me their new apartment. Larger now, brighter, filled with furniture they had chosen themselves. As her kids played with toys I kept in a basket for my grandson's visits, she told me she wanted to thank me, not just for the practical advice, but for showing her what it looks like to refuse to accept being treated badly. She said I saved her life. I made us tea, and we sat on my small terrace, watching her children giggle as they chased each other around the herb garden. The late afternoon light was golden, warm on our faces. I told her that she saved her own life. I just reminded her that it was worth saving. As I watched her children play, I thought about all the women who never get the chance to fight back, who die a little more each day until there's nothing left but the shell of who they used to be, who never learn that love shouldn't require you to disappear. I thought about my own mother, who spent 40 years married to a man who never acknowledged her dreams or opinions. She died at 71, still believing that self-sacrifice was the highest form of love. I wonder what she might have accomplished, who she might have become, if someone had told her she deserved better. But I also thought about the women who are fighting back right now, in apartments and houses across Chicago and beyond, who are learning, as I learned, that it's never too late to demand respect. That age doesn't disqualify you from dignity. That family relationships built on exploitation aren't worth preserving. This morning, I woke up naturally at 7:30, no alarm, no anxiety, no immediate mental list of other people's needs to meet. I made coffee in my yellow kitchen, tended to my herbs, and sat down to work on a painting I've been developing for weeks. It's a self-portrait, something I never would have attempted during my marriage. In it, I'm sitting in my chair by the window, morning light illuminating my face. My hair is completely gray now. I stopped coloring it months ago, and there are lines around my eyes that speak of both sorrow and joy. But my expression is peaceful. Content. The woman in the painting knows who she is and likes what she sees. Later today, I'll attend my watercolor class, have lunch with Isabel, and spend the evening reading a novel I chose simply because the cover intrigued me. Small pleasures that feel revolutionary after decades of serving everyone but myself. Tomorrow, I start training as a volunteer with the Elder Abuse Prevention Program at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. They need people who understand the patterns, who can recognize the signs, who can help other seniors realize they don't have to accept manipulation and control as the price of family connection. It's work that matters. Work that uses the hard-won wisdom of my own experience to help others avoid or escape similar situations. But tonight, I'll sit on my terrace with a glass of wine I bought, because I like the label, watching the sunset paint the Chicago skyline in shades of orange and gold. I'll listen to the sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, couples arguing and laughing, the eternal rhythm of life continuing all around me. And I'll remember that this peace, this contentment, this sense of finally coming home to myself, it was worth every difficult decision, every moment of uncertainty, every risk I took to get here. To anyone listening to this story, anyone who recognizes pieces of their own life in my experience, I want you to understand something. You matter. Your feelings matter. Your dreams matter. Your comfort and happiness matter just as much as anyone else's. It doesn't matter if you're 74 or 47 or 31. It doesn't matter if you've been accepting disrespect for 5 years or 50. It doesn't matter if the people mistreating you are family members you love or partners you've committed your life to. You deserve better. And more importantly, you have the power to demand better. The road isn't easy. There will be moments when standing up for yourself feels impossible, when the fear of loneliness seems worse than the reality of disrespect, when everyone around you insists you're being unreasonable for expecting basic human decency. But I promise you this. The peace that comes from finally honoring your own worth is greater than any temporary discomfort of setting boundaries. The joy of waking up in a life that belongs to you is worth every relationship you lose by refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. You are not too old, too dependent, too invested in the current situation to change it. You are not required to buy love with your silence, your service, or your submission. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Your life is not a rough draft. This is it, the only one you get. And you deserve to spend it surrounded by people who celebrate you rather than diminish you, who lift you up rather than tear you down, who see your full humanity rather than just your usefulness to them. Have you ever lived through something like this? Have you watched someone you love disappear into a relationship that consumed them? Have you felt the weight of family expectations that required you to sacrifice your own well-being for everyone else's convenience? Share your story in the comments below. Let others know they're not alone in this struggle. And if this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of your own worth or gave you courage to demand better treatment, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these truths that too often go unspoken. Remember, you matter. Your story matters, and it's never too late to start the next chapter on your own terms. Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for letting me remind you that you deserve all the love and respect you've been giving to everyone else. The sun is setting now over Chicago, painting my little apartment in golden light. I'm exactly where I belong, in a life I fought for, surrounded by beauty I created, at peace with choices I made for myself. This is what freedom looks like. This is what self-respect feels like. This is what happens when you finally come home to yourself. And it's never, ever too late to begin.